And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right.
That is what many believe is being weighed by California's first in the nation Reparations Task Force.
Act as if it's impossible to fail. We have to believe that we can make this change happen.
The group is examining counties like Kern, which has a history of being discriminatory towards African Americans even today. I'm Mikhala Armstrong, and this is a special report for 17 News. The task force is studying how the state might calculate financial compensation for reparations to California descendants of enslaved African Americans. And I spoke to Kern County residents about the importance of this legislation and if approved, what this could change for Black Californians. Reparations are not uncommon. The German government paid more than $86 billion to Holocaust victims and their heirs. In America, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 gave more than 82,000 Japanese Americans $20,000 each in reparations and a formal apology by President Reagan for their internment during World War II.
This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race.
However, for African Americans whose ancestors endured 250 years of slavery, there has been no headway regarding restitution except now at the state level.
In order to grant reparations or even to consider them, the country has to come to terms with what slavery was and did. And that's something that we've never done as a country.
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago for whom none of us currently living are responsible is a good idea. I think we're always a work in progress in this country, but no one currently alive was responsible for that.
We would all like to think that it's in the past and just get over it and just move on, and it's not that simple.
Almost knee-jerk reaction, particularly in white America, that if I allow my consciousness to reckon with racism and with how this country has treated African Americans, that's going to somehow interfere with or disrupt how I see myself as an American who comes from a nation that prides itself on liberty and justice for all.
We are literally the only population of people who have never received any form of reparations whatsoever, in any capacity.
America was built on the backs of slavery.
It's always refreshing to make something right for both parties, the one that has done the wrong. But what they're saying and they're thinking is, well, I didn't commit that wrong, others did. But you cannot excuse the ramifications, the results of that wrong, and especially if you find out through data and research that it still has a negative impact on the people, on the African Americans.
I think specifically here in California, it's often glossed over because it's not the Jim Crow South. And because it's not the Jim Crow South, people think that, oh, they don't need it there because slavery wasn't as bad here. But slavery was bad here.
The American Civil War ends. Slavery is abolished. The Ku Klux Klan grows in numbers, including California. Reparations. Let's talk about it. Returns.
Though California joined the Union as a free state in 1850, the state has a far more complicated history. According to the California Historical Society, when the gold rush hit in 1848, white Southerners came to the state with hundreds of enslaved black people. Many white Southerners made their fortunes on the back of this free labor, amassing over $3,000 in personal property, wealth equivalent to more than $114,000 today. Those fortunes grew when state lawmakers passed a law in 1852 that any black person who had entered California as an enslaved person before statehood was the legal property of the slaveholder who brought them. The Reparations Task Force estimates that despite California's anti-slavery constitution, about 1,500 enslaved black people lived in the state in 1852. Yet that fact is missing from most historical accounts, and many are surprised to learn this took place in the state.
No one kept records of that. For instance, when Dr. Martin Luther King first came here, I marched with him. There's no record of that.
Many people settled in Kern County from southern states like Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas at the close of the Civil War.
It brought back the look of Louisiana, in which I was born, with that migration to work the fields in Bakersfield, California, Kern County, where I became a competitor and a hard worker, picking over 500 pounds of cotton and picking over 40 sacks of potatoes a day.
However, according to histories by California State University, Bakersfield, blacks' arrival in the county caused a problem for poor whites.
The poor white people didn't want to work in the field with the black people.
So poor whites pressured landowners to get rid of the blacks. Some poor whites actively worked to frighten black workers to leave the county, according to CSUB, cutting the black population to 25 families by 1894. How systematic racism and slavery harmed African Americans is a primary focus of the Reparations Task Force. According to the Reparations Task Force report, after the country formally abolished slavery, California became a breeding ground for the Ku Klux Klan. Some records show in the 1920s the KKK hosted more events in California than it did in Louisiana or Mississippi. For example, according to Cal Matters, Kern County Klansmen routinely beat and kidnapped black and Latino residents in the 1920s.
That's racism. That's how deep it was. It's still systemically deep, and it's something that takes the soul of individuals and the nation at task.
Black America continues to move into Kern County. Racism lives in many neighborhoods throughout our community. Local leaders share their stories of the past and the present. Reparations. Let's talk about it. Returns.
Our guest today on Meet the Press is Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who led the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize.
But we do feel that as long as the conditions of injustice and man's inhumanity to man, it would be necessary to demonstrate in order to bring these issues to the surface and lay them square before the conscience of the nation.
Kern County has one of the longest standing African American communities in the Central Valley. According to the census, African Americans make up 6.3% of Kern's population, and African Americans have lived in Bakersfield since at least the early 1880s. However, according to racecounts.org, Kern County black residents are more impacted by racial disparity than other races. That is demonstrated by statistics that show discrimination in wages preventing many from reaching their true social and economic potential.
We stood against the injustices. Some people's lives were at stake, and jobs were always at stake anytime someone spoke out. So they would call me and tell me not to put pressure on the white people because they lose their jobs. Others that were in the power seats would call and threaten my life and my family's life. And people complied with it. And when you made a stand, you were blackballed.
The task force report also references numerous instances of segregation and restrictive housing agreements across the state. It describes the destruction of several black neighborhoods and cities as a part of the country's, quote, redevelopment policy signed by President Truman with the 1949 Housing Act. It authorized the demolition and reconstruction of urban neighborhoods, targeting places that were considered low income and not white. According to the task force, an example in California is the Fillmore.
All right, they talk about the South. The South is not half as bad as San Francisco. You want me to tell you about San Francisco? I'll tell you about San Francisco. The white man, he's not taking advantage of you out in public like they're doing down in Birmingham, but he's killing you with that filth in the paper, brother.
A once thriving black business district in San Francisco destroyed in the 1970s, displacing more than 20,000 people from more than 4,500 homes and destroying more than 800 businesses. In Kern County, African Americans experienced displacement and segregation as well, particularly with being unable to live everywhere in Kern, like Taft. Taft is listed in the book Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism by sociologist James W. Lowen. In addition, all white neighborhoods purposely exclude non-whites through discrimination with local laws, intimidation, and even violence. Or Oildale, a community notoriously known for its history towards African Americans, according to Histories by CSUB.
We were there, we went, we worked, but we had to be out of there by sundown. The sign says leave before sundown, or even in Oildale. Same thing, ignorance, racism, fear, people just being evil.
Wage gaps, racism, real estate practices, Kern County black communities disappearing. Local law enforcement statistics toward black people begin to shift. Reparations, let's talk about it, returns.
The strangest part about it is everybody here keeps going. Every one of them must know deep down there's very little chance that what they want will be given anytime soon.
In a California State University Bakersfield study, racist real estate agents among lending institutions prevented many African Americans from purchasing certain homes well into the 1960s, leaving blacks with a mortgage rejection rate of 38.7% in the county and the lowest home ownership rate of 33.1% as of 2020, according to racecounts.org.
They were not playing on a level playing field. You know, there was a lot of closed doors.
My parents had a very difficult time telling me about being turned away from restaurants and the redlining and only being able to buy property in a certain part of town. It's painful.
Pain that is carried on today throughout the state, outlined in the Reparation Report, of African Americans facing decades of persistent disparities in home ownership, life expectancy, wealth, and other areas. A big contributor to that could be redlining, the practice of denying mortgages to black homeowners and devaluing residential properties in primarily minority neighborhoods, using a color-coded system designating redlined or high-risk areas ineligible for federal mortgage insurance.
And when you begin to engage in policies and practices that undermine your ability to be a homeowner, which is like a fundamental rite of passage into generational wealth building in this country, to deny that for entire groups of people just because of their race is incredibly harmful.
According to a study by Today's Homeowner, only 6 cities in the country do not have a home ownership gap between blacks and whites. None are in Kern County. In 1960, the white home ownership rate was 65%, and the black rate was 38%, a 27-point gap. According to Pew Research, in 2022, 74.6% of white households own their homes, compared to 45.3% of black households, a more than 29-point gap.
The move of black people from downtown to the Mayflower district was one of those moves. Now, the black community that did exist is no longer that. It's little by little declined.
In the 2019 census, the median income for black households was only 60% of the median income for white households. According to the Economic Policy Institute, black workers face significant wage gaps, which continues to grow. In 2019, the typical black worker earned 24.4% less per hour than the typical white worker. That is an even larger wage gap than in 1979, when it was 16.4%.
African Americans are service, restaurants, and other things like that, retail businesses. That's where they steer African Americans toward, and these businesses normally pay minimum wage.
And for those who are left unemployed, according to the Federal Reserve economic data, the Black unemployment rate is consistently twice the white unemployment rate. The poverty rate for Black Americans in 2019 was the lowest on record at 18.8%. Still, that's more than double of white Americans, who had a poverty rate of 7.3%. The census stated the rate reflected being traditionally disadvantaged compared to other groups over time. A problem activist, Angela Davis, addressed at California State University Fullerton in 1972.
If you take working people of color, and if you compare the wages which we receive to the wages which white workers doing the very same jobs, and I'm using government statistics that the government has given us, you find that there is a $28 million differential just because of the existence of racism. And that's a lot of money, because we could buy a lot of houses and build a lot of schools and a lot of child care centers and a lot of the things that we need in the ghetto and the barrio with that $28 million.
According to medical research, Black Americans have a lower life expectancy than white Americans, due partly to the discriminatory practices of denying services to people based on their race. In Kern, Blacks are expected to live 70.7 years as opposed to nearly 75 years for their white counterparts, according to racecounts.org. Black people, who account for 13% of the U.S. population, accounted for 27% of those fatally shot and killed by police in 2021. According to Mapping Police Violence, a nonprofit group that tracks police shootings. That means Black people are twice as likely as white people to be shot and killed by police officers. Also, Black Americans are imprisoned at a rate roughly 5 times the rate of white Americans. In Kern County, Blacks have the highest arrest rate per youth under 18 at 31.8 per 10,000 youth, and Blacks have the highest rate of civilian injuries by law enforcement at 6.7 per 100,000 people, according to Race Counts. And in a California health interview survey ranging from 2011 to 2020, only 20,000 Black adults in Kern County felt safe in their neighborhood.
What do reparations mean to Kern County? The economic impact for the Black community and America. How soon could a change be made? Reparations, let's talk about it, concludes when we return.
There are so many areas that slavery impacted, including mental health. So traumatic events that happened during slavery are just repeated and reinforced and still with us.
Each of these harms are being assessed in the reparations report. This will help shape the task force's final suggestion of the total amount for each individual.
A lot of our businesses were taken, a lot of our homes were taken, and so through reparations, people are able to potentially purchase back some of those things that were taken.
If the state legislature approves, the task force suggests more remedies beyond just cash restitution, like an apology.
You know, the truth hurts. But in order to make progress, you got to take the hurt to get to the point of doing something about it.
There's a lot of healing that has to go on, and I feel that that conversation and that healing has to happen maybe as a precursor to even granting reparations,
which could bring some atonement for the wrongs of the past.
I believe it will be a step in the right direction. I believe a step in the right direction is better than no step in the right direction. And so with so much talk and rhetoric that has happened over so many years, this moving forward with actual policy and actual plan in place and really detailing the nuances that happen within the Black community and how it has affected us and how we can create that change, I believe will help really mitigate some of those issues that were happening.
And could be the change many have waited to see in their lifetime.
The election of President Obama was a significant event. I can't find the right word to explain it.
This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall. And and why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served at a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath.
So I know reparations is the other. And I tell people all the time, whether they want to hear it or not, we have to look systemic racism in the eye, and we have to look reparations in the eye. Just don't fear the word. It's like restoration, reconciliation, reimagine.
The Reparations Task Force will present its final report for reparations in July. If approved, this report could address specific instances of the past and the present and support future generations of Black Californians. I'm Mikhala Armstrong, 17 News.